It is now a real honor, a true honor, to welcome Carter Snead to us. Carter is one of the most well-known and influential Catholic bioethicists, not just in the U.S., but in the world. He is the director of the Nicola Institute for Ethics and Culture at Notre Dame University, where he also holds conjointly a professorship in law and a professorship in political science. He has just written a book called What It Means to Be Human, A Case for the Body in Public Bioethics, which has really gotten a huge amount of press and traction. And in fact, the Wall Street Journal indicated that it was one of the 10 best books of the year. He has written countless scholarly articles. In addition to that, he edits 2 series at Notre Dame, one on Catholic ideas for a secular culture, and the Notre Dame Studies on bioethics. He also is a member of the fellowship, actually a fellowship of the Hastings Institute, one of the best-known secular bioethics institutes in the world, and he was appointed by Pope Francis to be a member of the Council for Life. He has a number of other distinctions, a number of consultations that he has done internationally. He has consulted with every single branch of government. He was also on the President's Commission for Bioethics. This is one that was chaired by Leon Cass, very, very famous commission, and he also, this is during the Bush administration. In addition to that, he really does have accolades and awards that I haven't even begun to acknowledge, and he seems so young to me. But the point is, he will be talking about that great book today, and really he is an influence that we need more of in this culture for the protection of life and liberty. But his book, he's going to be discussing his book, What Does It Mean to Be Human? A Case for the Body in Public Bioethics. Carter Snead.
Thank you so much, Father Spitzer, and my mother thanks you for reciting that introduction exactly as she wrote it. So thank you, I appreciate that. Yeah, it's always a pleasure to speak here at the Napa Institute. Not just speak, but be at the Napa Institute. It's such an essential, life-giving institution in our church and in our world. And congratulations again to Tim and John and the whole team for this amazing return to in-person fellowship. So thank you guys so much for your attention today. I am, as Father Spitzer said, discussing the substance of a book that I recently published, a book that I will be signing for people if they wish in the Carneros lobby and after this talk. So if you'd like to have conversation about it or have a book signed, I'll be there to meet you, and it'll be a pleasure to do so. So the claims of the talk, briefly, are the same as the claims of the book. Namely, I make a methodological claim about how best to understand public bioethical questions and to analyze them and to evaluate them for their justice and their humanity and their wisdom, but also a substantive claim about what happens when you analyze what I call the vital conflicts of the law and policy of abortion and end-of-life decision-making and assisted reproduction through this lens, through this what we call, as Catholics and as participants at the Napa Institute understand what we mean when we say through an anthropological lens, through the lens of the question of what it means to be human and what to flourish as a human being. And when you train your analysis on these particular areas of the law, what you find is a vision of human identity and human flourishing that is false and impoverished and leads to highly destructive and problematic results. So the first point, again, is the richest way into understanding public bioethical questions is to ask the question of what vision of human personhood and human flourishing is anchoring and underwriting and animating that law and public policy. What does the law assume you and I are, and what our thriving consists in? And then the substantive claim emerges from analyzing these vital conflicts through that particular lens. So I'll start out very briefly defining for you, really in one sentence, what I mean by public bioethics. I'll say a little bit more about the anthropological analysis of law and public policy and why I think it's such a fruitful point of entry. For we as citizens, the best way to understand laws and policies is to ask precisely these anthropological questions. Then I'll pivot and talk a little bit about the vision of human flourishing and identity that is assumed by the law of abortion and assisted reproduction and end-of-life decision-making, and explain that vision of human flourishing, which I describe as expressive individualism, why it falls far short of the mark and doesn't capture the full lived complexity of our lives, both individually and in a shared way. I'll then talk about how we might repair the analytic foundations of the law, the anthropological foundations of the law, by restoring a full vision of what it means to be and flourish as a human being, and what the virtues are, following on Father Landry's talk, what the virtues and practices are we need to thrive and flourish as full human persons. And if there's time, I'll talk a little bit in a more concrete way about how the law of assisted reproductive technologies suffers from these defects and what we might do to try to repair the damage that's been caused by a false anthropology grounding the legal landscape in America on that issue. So, what do I mean by public bioethics? Public bioethics, very simply, is the governance of science, medicine, and biotechnology in the name of ethical goods. It's not merely a field of intellectual inquiry. It's not merely asking questions about the ethics of abortion or assisted reproduction or embryo research or end-of-life decision-making. It is rather the point at which the law and public policy come into contact with these ethical questions, when we seek to govern ourselves on these ethical questions. And that can take a wide variety of forms. It can, of course, take the forms of criminal prohibition or perhaps even positive inducement, federal funding for certain kinds of research. But between those 2 points, there's a very fine-grained mechanism of action that the law can adopt to allow for a wide array of both symbolic and substantive interventions to try to encourage certain kinds of behaviors, deter other kinds of behaviors, make space for private ordering among voluntary associations. And so it's not merely a binary up or down. The law is extraordinarily supple and complex and can speak in a variety of ways in this deeply complicated area of law and public policy. So the issues in public bioethics are manifold. They cover the landscape from protection involving human subjects of research, to embryo and fetal research, to definition of death, to property in the body, buying and selling the body and its parts. The 3 areas that I focused on in the book and that I'll say a little bit more about today relates to assisted reproductive technologies, abortion, and end-of-life decision-making, including the relatively new threats of legalizing assisted suicide, which of course in California has happened within the past couple of years, tragically. So, what on earth does law have to do with anthropology? Why would I suggest that the right question to ask when you're analyzing a law or public policy is what vision of human personhood and human identity and human flourishing is assumed by the law? And the answer is very straightforward and simple. Law is about the protection and flourishing of persons. That's what law is for. Without that, law is at best arbitrary and capricious. Law is designed to protect people and to promote the flourishing of people in a wide variety of ways. And if that's true, and it is true, the law has to rest upon a set of prior assumptions about what and who a person is, about what constitutes human flourishing. And this is not exactly the question of when life begins, although it's deeply connected to that. It's about who we are, who you and I are, what constitutes our flourishing, what are our needs, what are the threats to us, what do we need for our flourishing and our success and to be what we're supposed to be. The law has to operate from fundamental assumptions about those questions in order to even be intelligible, because the purpose of the law is to advance those particular goods. And because that's true, the richest and deepest understanding of law itself is anthropological. It is to ask the fundamental question, what does the law assume about me, my needs, my desires, threats to me, even threats that I pose to myself and temptations that I might be tempted to succumb to? Who and what does the law assume a person to be? And then the next question is, of course, is the law built on a true or false understanding of human nature? Because if you build law on a false understanding of what persons are and what their flourishing is, then the law is going to go terribly wrong. And that's precisely what we've seen in the areas of abortion, assisted reproductive technologies, and end-of-life decision-making and assisted suicide in the United States. And the reason for that is because the law has a false assumption, a very attractive but false assumption about who we are and what our flourishing is, And the word to describe that false image of the human person and human flourishing is expressive individualism. It's a term that was coined by social scientist Robert Bellah in the 1980s in his magisterial study of American culture in the 70s and 80s, person's self-understanding, what they understood themselves to be and what their lives' goals were. It's in the book called Habits of the Heart. And he described a particular self-image that was widely shared in our culture. And when I describe this to you, I think you'll feel, it'll resonate, you'll recognize it as something that we see in our culture, even in temptations to ourselves, to how to think about ourselves and what our flourishing is. But in short, what expressive individualism holds about the person is that the person is an isolated, unencumbered, atomized, to use a word from Catholic philosopher Charles Taylor, individual self. That's the fundamental human reality, is the individual, stripped from all constitutive attachments, stripped and abstracted from any connections that we might have to family or tradition or to our faith or to our community or to our shared history. The individual abstracted from all those attachments is the fundamental reality according to the anthropology of expressive individualism. And that person, we, are defined merely and strictly by our will, defined entirely by our capacity to choose. It's a strictly cognitive account of what a human being is. A human being is coextensive with his or her will, with her capacity to choose or to formulate desires. And everything else is instrumental. The body is instrumental, our relationships are instrumental, the natural world is instrumental, all of which can be bent and harnessed and exploited to pursue the projects that we discover by interrogating the depths of ourself. The person is defined as an individual chooser or consumer, and human flourishing is defined as pursuing those projects of your own construction, to think deeply, to think and reflect on the interior preferences and views and sentiments that you have, and to discover your authentic, original truth. Does that sound familiar? It should. It's behind every single ad campaign that we see when we watch television today or read a newspaper. To find your truth, to express your truth, to live your originality. You are, in the words of Jewish philosopher Michael Sandel, a self-originating source of valid claims. There is no sense in which the external world, our bodies, what we do, the shape and function and structure and function of the natural world, is useful to help us understand and negotiate that world. To use a philosophical term, it is anti-teleological. External givens are not normative for us. Only the unique and original inner voice is definitive. And there are no such thing as unchosen obligations. No one has a claim on us that we don't grant our consent to in advance. Okay? All that matters is the inner voice, what it tells us to do, expressing that and configuring our life plan accordingly, even if it's transgressive, even if it violates the norms of our society. There are no unchosen attachments, and personal relationships, including family relationships, are merely instrumental and transactional, and people encounter one another as isolated collaborators occasionally. If we have mutual goals in mind, we come apart when those mutual goals are no longer mutual. But sometimes we encounter each other as adversaries, clad in the armor of our individual rights and our own individual freedoms as we see them. And ethical goods become reduced to one good. And the one good it's reduced to is autonomy, self-determination, the highest good to which all others are subordinated. And injustice is reconceived as constraints on your freedom to pursue projects of your own choosing. And the role of government and law is simply to remove those constraints, public constraints, private constraints, maybe even natural constraints, and otherwise provide the conditions for the assertion of the unencumbered individual self. Now, this is a very sexy vision of what it means to be a person, right? To be able to bestride the universe and blaze your own trail. It's literally satanic, right? If you read Paradise Lost, this is Satan's vision of himself. He's like, I don't remember being created. I'm not a creature. I don't belong to you. I don't owe anything to you. Non serviam. I'm not going to do this. I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to impose my will on the world and blaze my own transgressive trail. And there's something appealing about that. It appeals to our vanity, to our narcissism. But more importantly, it's destructive because it is forgetful of the body. It fails to understand that our bodies and our lives as embodied beings, as dynamic integrated unities of mind and body, are not simply disembodied wills seeking to pursue our own goals, but instead we're dynamic, integrated, embodied beings who live in community with one another and have obligations to one another. Lived embodied reality means that we are mutually dependent on one another because we are fragile bodies, corruptible, fragile bodies in time. We are vulnerable. So that situates us in relationship to one another in a very particular way. We're subject to natural limits. And what we need to flourish as human beings are what Alistair McIntyre, my colleague at Notre Dame, describes as networks of uncalculated and unconditional giving and graceful receiving. To flourish as a human being, we need to take care of each other. And this is obviously true when we come into the world as a totally vulnerable and dependent child. It's true if everything goes as best as it could possibly go, and we have a gentle arc to the height of our powers and a gentle transition downwards back into total dependence once again, right? But that's the human condition. And it's in fact a beautiful condition because it's not simply that we depend on each other for our basic survival. We depend on each other to learn to become the thing that we're meant to be. We need to become the kind of person who can make the good of another our own good without seeking anything in return. That's what these networks are comprised of. They're comprised of persons who are willing to be friends in the authentic Aristotelian Thomistic sense. Friends, people who make the good of someone else their own good. And in participating in these networks, you don't just survive, you flourish. You become what you're meant to be. You learn to become a friend. And to put it most succinctly, I argue in the book that by virtue of our embodied selves, we are made for love and friendship. And there are people who have claims on me that I don't choose. There are people who I have to serve, who I don't choose in advance to serve. There are people that I can ask help from, who I don't choose, who haven't chosen to help me. The most pristine example, of course, of this network of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving is the parent and child relationship. A parent doesn't take care of a child because he or she is signed a contract to do so. A child doesn't have to earn the right to be cared for by his or her parent. It's what it means to be a person. And to live according to the vision of personhood that's dictated by expressive individualism is to fail to recognize the unchosen claims of the weak, including children, born and unborn, the disabled and the elderly, to not even make sense of our own fragility, to be lonely and dislocated and alienated because you can't have constitutive attachments. Nobody understands you but you. It's death-haunted, as Solzhenitsyn said. When you're the center of the universe, your death constitutes the end of the universe. And that is a terrifying, terrifying prospect. It's not that you stand in relation to others and stories of others that overlap, that stretch behind you in time and stretch out in front of you in time. It's just you. And that death-haunted existence looms very large for American public bioethics for reasons that we can discuss later. And of course, when I'm the center of my own universe and all that matters is blazing my own trail and following my own life plan, my own authentic original truth as I see it, my familial and social ties become eroded because they're merely instrumental to the pursuit of my own hopes and dreams. So what we have to do to be able to shore up and build these networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving are to practice what McIntyre calls the virtues of acknowledged dependence, the virtues that are necessary for embodied reality, the virtues of uncalculated giving, just generosity, hospitality, misericordia, which means accompanying others in their suffering, and making their suffering your suffering, and when you can't heal them or comfort them, simply to accompany them, as well as the virtues of graceful receiving, the virtue of gratitude, which is the proper posture towards the gift of life and the gift of friendship and the uncalculated giving that we're benefited to receive. The only reason any of us are here in this room right now is because someone made our good their good. Our parents probably made our good their good, to take care for us and to empty themselves and to sacrificially care for us, not because we were beautiful or special or could even reciprocate their affection, but because that's what it means to be a parent. And the appropriate posture towards that reality is gratitude. Right? And gratitude begets humility. You realize the world is gift, that all is gift. And you become open to the unbidden, and you become tolerant of imperfection, and you don't try to impose your rational mastery on the world around you to reflect your will, but rather the goods that come to you as they come to you. And then the good of solidarity, realizing we're all in this together. The good of human dignity, the intrinsic equal dignity of every human being, born and unborn. Truthfulness. And of course, all of this can be understood through the lens of genuine friendship. Now, in the very brief time I have remaining, I want to say a few words about the American law of assisted reproductive technology. Now, remember I said when you're confronted with a body of law and public policy, you want to ask, what vision of the human person in flourishing underwrites and animates this area? And you look at the law of American assisted reproductive technology, And what you see is the absence of law. It's kind of the opposite of abortion, where everything is defined by the Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. This is about the absence of law, where you can pretty much do whatever you want to do in order to make a baby that is suitable to your own particular needs. And the theoretical underpinning of this legal landscape emerges from both the practitioners in these fields, like Jerry Shatton from the University of Pittsburgh, who came to the President's Council on Bioethics after 6 weeks of reflection and told us the point of reproductive genetics, the reproductive technology augmented by genomic knowledge, is to, quote, help parents realize their dream of a disease-free legacy. The word child is missing from that sentence, isn't it? It's implied by the word parent, but I don't think it's implied by the speaker there. It's about parents realizing their dreams of a disease-free legacy. And John Robertson, who is the chief ethics officer for the American Society for Reproductive Medicine for decades, and he passed away a few years ago, God rest his soul, but he was the intellectual architect behind this absence of law, because the lobbying arm of this professional society made sure that there would be no restrictions on the capacity to make babies in these ways. And he wrote a very influential book in 1994 called Children of Choice, in which he said, the choice to pursue or avoid procreation is essential to self-definition, the pursuit of desires, and self-expression. That's why we have the freedom to reproduce or not reproduce. And the consequences of this landscape have been devastating. We have regular instances in which there are multiple gestations because multiple embryos are conceived and transferred per cycle without any limitation, which creates risks of hazards for mothers and children alike. We have 1 million embryonic human beings in freezers in the United States today, and we have a constant demand for research involving these embryonic human beings, their use and destruction. Almost every clinic in America that practices IVF offers sex selection. We have trait selection offered by unscrupulous consumers and reproductive medicine practitioners, where you can select the non-medical traits of your child. We even talk about human cloning and genetic engineering and gene editing. We have markets for gametes where people buy and sell not just sperm of particular kinds of folks, but they offer thousands, in some cases tens of thousands of dollars to young women with high SAT scores and athletic records of success and certain kinds of height and appearance to give their eggs to be used for some other people to produce a child of their choosing. We have gestational surrogacy has become big business in many parts of the country, where quality assurance is part of the equation, in which you have parents like these folks demanding that that baby, you see, God bless her, she was born because her surrogate mother chose not to get an abortion when the contracting parents demanded that she do so because the baby had Down syndrome. Okay? The anthropological meaning of this legal landscape of commerce and commodification and choice and rational mastery is persons conceived as individuals pursuing a self-identifying plan. The goods at stake are framed in terms of expressive individualism. It's privacy, it's choice, it's rational mastery, it's bargain for exchange. What's missing? Embodiment, especially involving procreation, the meaning of embodiment, the fact that we come into the world already embedded in relationships to other people, vulnerability, dependence, finitude, relationships among the generations, reciprocal indebtedness, unchosen obligations to vulnerable others, tolerance of disability or imperfection, openness to the unbidden, even the very concepts of children and parents and family. Instead, children and family are reconceived through the lens of the will, a project freely chosen and constructed or rejected for our own ends, sometimes with the aid of technology. The parents' dream of a disease-free legacy, no unchosen obligations. Now, let me say something very important. I am not arguing that people who go to IVF clinics have this vision of what they're doing, that they think that what they're doing is imposing their unencumbered self on inchoate matter to become the baby of their dreams. That's not what's happening. In fact, it's quite the opposite. People who seek fertility treatment are people who feel betrayed by their bodies, people who want to be parents. That's what they want to be. They want to be a parent, and that implies a relationship. They want to be a parent to a child. They want to have children. They want to be loving parents. But the law doesn't assume that that's what they want. That the law doesn't assume that what they want to do is to bring into being a child that they welcome and love unconditionally no matter what. What the law assumes is this false image of expressive individualism. The law assumes what they want is to be an atomized will seeking to assert their unencumbered self, and the law constructs a landscape with no guardrails. Doesn't protect them from unscrupulous practitioners, doesn't protect them from their own temptations. These people are exhausted, they're sad, they're broke. They just need help. And the law doesn't offer them help. The law says, do what you will. No guardrails. Make a baby however you see fit. And it is a terrible situation. And the law is wrong to do this. How do we recover what we need to be? How do we get back to a full, true anthropological understanding about who we are? And that we have to start with the paradigm of parenthood. Leon Cass, my wonderful mentor and beloved friend, said something very beautiful years and years ago. He said, a child is a gift. A child is a mysterious stranger that one welcomes and loves unconditionally. And the right attitude towards a gift is gratitude and openness and self-emptying love. It's not rational mastery and control and construction. We have to think about this through the lens of procreation, not making babies. They are gifts, they are not projects. And to ask the question of what forms of procreation align with the notion of child as gift versus what forms of reproduction reflect the imposition of rational mastery, control, and technology to produce a desired outcome. It's the paradigm of gift versus the paradigm of project. And when we look at the law and when we debate the law, and thank goodness the Supreme Court lets us, unlike in the area of abortion, debate what the law should be in this area and what the public policy should be in this area. We can have this conversation and say, we're going to have those laws and policies that correspond to the notion that the child is a gift to be welcomed and loved unconditionally, and we're not going to do those things that violate that proposition. We're going to embrace a paradigm of parenthood, procreation, not baby making, equal dignity, not exploitation, healing, not enhancement, embodiment, not mere will, humility, not hubris, solidarity, not radical individualism, family, not mere partnership in a project, love and openness, not force and control. That is what it means to be human in the context of assisted reproductive technologies. And our law should reflect that. Our law should shore up and construct and strengthen those networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving so that every child who is born, let me strike that, every child who is conceived is welcomed and loved unconditionally, and we act in her best interests from very beginning to end and accompanying her throughout her entire life. Thank you so much for your attention. Please, if you want to read the book, come join me in the Carneros lobby after this. I'm happy to sign your books or book plates. But again, thank you for coming to the Napa Institute. Thank you what you do for this church and for building up a culture of life and a civilization of love. Thank you very much.
I do believe that was one of the most insightful talks I have heard, not just in the area of public law, but truly in philosophy. I think every Catholic university student who studies philosophy of the human person should hear that lecture at the beginning of their course, because it really avoids a multitude of problems. I mean, just the very thought that the solution to the problem lies in embodiment rather than the autonomous will, and the very thought that self-giving should replace self-determination as the objective of the will, those two thoughts alone are worth the price of a Catholic education. And then to compound it into a whole philosophy of law that can be used to defeat the culture of death is really a mark of genius. And I think this is just a terrific talk. I'm so grateful for it, Carter, and thank you for really helping us to understand. I would go ahead and buy the book and have him sign it. Thanks, Carter, very, very much for helping us.